Last week, Google fired a male employee over his 3,300-word memo that claimed women are underrepresented in tech, partly because of biological differences such as higher neuroticism and interest in people. Today, only 31% of Google's employees are women. The company's tech sector, that number falls to 20%. It brings me to my question of the week. What percentage of Fortune 500 CEOs are women? 32%, 27%, 19%, or 6%? Stay tuned and we'll tell you the correct answer. This week's book of the week is Mark Lillers' new book, The Once and Future Liberal After Identity Politics, which you heard about earlier in the show. It's a terrific short book about the decline of American liberalism, explaining how the Democrats went from the successes of FDR's coalition to the pitfalls of today's identity politics. It's an accessible book that's essential reading for anyone who wants to understand how we arrived in the Trump era, where the Democrats go from here. Now for the last look. This week, residents of Guam breathed a sigh of relief after North Korea announced that Kim Jong-un would watch a little more the foolish and stupid conduct of the Yankees before deciding to launch missiles near the island. But there is another problem pestering this paradise. Although there are only 163,000 people on the island, there are as many as 2 million brown tree snakes. That's right. For every one human, there are 12 of this invasive species slithering through the trees. These serpents have reportedly cost millions by regularly shorting the island's electrical systems. They have killed most of Guam's native bird species. And did I mention 12 snakes for every human? The solution seems to be drugged mice. You see, it turns out brown tree snakes love to eat mice and are easily killed by acetaminophen. In other words, Tylenol. Put that in dead mice and parachute them around the island. Delivered last meals for many snakes. The USDA has done this multiple times before, going back at least 7 years. They are now set for another round in October, giving the beleaguered Guamanians a slightly less terrifying reason to look toward the sky. The answer to my GPS challenge question this week is D. Only 6%, or a total of 32 CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, are female. While this might seem startlingly small, there are more female CEOs in the Fortune 500 list than ever before, meaning this tiny figure still does signify progress. Women fare slightly better in the tech world at large. Of all computing employees, and that includes jobs like programmers, developers, and IT support, only 26% were female, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But even with things looking up, there is a long way to go. Thanks to all of you for being part of my program this week. I will see you next week.
Hello, and thanks for joining me. I'm Jim Today for Frederica Whitfield. President Trump hoping to turn the page after a turbulent week of backlash over his response to the Charlottesville violence. Much of that criticism coming this morning from inside his own party.
As we look to the future, it's going to be very difficult for this president to lead if, in fact, moral authority remains compromised.
You know, blaming one side or another when we're talking about the KKK or white supremacists, there is no comparison between hate groups and everybody else.
Those were just two Republicans you were hearing from. And now, as the president returns from his working vacation and prepares for a campaign-style rally on Tuesday in Phoenix, Arizona, a brand new poll shows that his approval numbers in 3 states that he won have now fallen below 40%. This as North Korea issues a new nuclear threat to the U.S. The rogue nation says that it is now ready to, quote, mercilessly strike as it accuses the, quote, reckless U.S. of driving the two countries to the brink of nuclear war. We'll have more on that in just a minute, but first, we begin in Bedminster, New Jersey, where the president is spending the final hours of that working vacation. CNN's Boris Sanchez nearby in Bridgewater. Boris, the president returning to the White House. He will not be there for long, though.
That's right, Jim. The president's 17-day working vacation to Bedminster, New Jersey wraps up today. He's heading back to Washington, D.C. tonight, but as you said, he is heading to Arizona this week. On Tuesday, he is going to take part in some kind of tour in Yuma. We don't have clarity on specifically what he will be touring, but we know that later that night he is going to head to Phoenix for a rally. And the White House has been reeling, as you said, Jim, from the president's press conference last Tuesday that received harsh criticism from both sides of the aisle. Many in his own party are now urging the president to be more inclusive in his language, and specifically at this rally on Phoenix, some want to see him take a much more conciliatory tone. One of the president's critics, John Kasich, the governor of Ohio, was on State of the Union this morning with Jake Tapper. Listen to what he said.
The president is our president. We want him to be successful. People around him have to get to him, including his own family, to say, okay, you need to show leadership. You need to bring the country together. You're going to go to Phoenix and make a speech, fine. That's your right. You can go there. He's got free speech just like the rest of us have it. But when you go, try to use that as an opportunity to say something that's going to bring people together.
Now, some have actually gone further than that, Jim, including the mayor of Phoenix. You know, over the past several days, there's been speculation that the president might use this rally as an occasion to pardon Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who's been heavily criticized across the country for racial profiling in the state of Arizona. The president himself said that it was something he was considering. Here's a statement from the mayor of Phoenix, Greg Stanton, who writes, quote, "If President Trump is coming to Phoenix to announce a pardon for former Sheriff Joe Arpaio, then it will be clear that his true intent is to inflame emotions and further divide our nation. It is my hope that more sound judgment prevails and that he delays his visit." Jim, we've received no indication so far from the White House that the president has any intention of delaying this visit. No indication yet as to whether or not he may end up pardoning Sheriff Arpaio. Jim?
Boris Chan says they're traveling with the president. President Trump faced his fair share of heat, as we've said this week, over his response to the Charlottesville violence. And as we said, it wasn't just Democrats, Republicans adding their voices to the chorus of criticism, too. This morning, several lawmakers said their word on the Sunday shows.
Where I want to look now is what are we going to do to deal with the fundamental issues that we have in the country, the issue of race, the issue of police and community coming together and developing policing methods that can unify.
You know, anyone that's committing violence ought to be condemned. Anyone. There's no justification for it whatsoever. And we can't allow the commander-in-chief to somehow equate the handful of people that would make those protests violent with any kind of sentiment that condones white supremacy or neo-Nazism.
Well, I think what he said on Monday was fantastic. It would have been even better had he said it on Saturday. What he said on Tuesday was just really challenging. What the president should do before he says something is to sit down and become better acquainted, have a personal connection to the painful history of racism and bigotry of this country.
It is not just fellow politicians who are disappointed in how the president is handling his job today. A new poll of Rust Belt states that helped push President Trump into the White House show that his approval numbers are dropping to new lows, and this is key, below the 40% mark. The new NBC News Marist poll surveyed voters in 3 states that Trump won in 2016, key states. In Michigan, 36% of adults approve of his job performance. In Pennsylvania, just 33%. Same in Wisconsin. Of course, you remember what a key role those states played in his election win. All of them surprises, really, taking them away from Hillary Clinton, the Democrat. Let's discuss this now with our panel. Julian Zelizer is a CNN political analyst. He's also a historian at Princeton University. Tanzina Vega is CNN's race and inequality reporter, and Andre Brower is the former lieutenant governor of South Carolina, Trump supporter as well. Julian, I want to start with you as we look at these numbers. This poll, we should mention, was conducted after the violence, the unrest in Charlottesville. We're just 7 months into the president's term, and yet we're 3.5 years nearly from the next presidential election. How key are these approval numbers right now, today?
Well, they're important because Republicans are not looking at 2020. Politically, they're looking at 2018. And they're trying to figure out what impact might this have on the midterms. And some Republicans are also trying to figure out what impact do the statements from that press conference and other statements that he has made have on the reputation and image of the GOP more broadly. So I think the poll numbers are significant, even if they come very early in the presidency.
Andre Braugher, do you sense nervousness within Trump's team? Do you look at these numbers and see concern about 2018 as well as 2020?
Well, I don't know that you immediately see concern. You'd always rather have your poll numbers better than going in the opposite direction. But more than anything, what's important to me is when I supported Donald Trump, I wanted to see somebody come in and make substantial change. What he's got to do more than anything right now is he's got to make sure that he works with members of Congress. And so if they get down on him and he can't get his agenda passed, that's where the real problem lies. If he can get people back to work, if he can continue to make people's lives better, a lot of this other stuff will go away. But one of the strong suits in my 14 years in the General Assembly and Lieutenant Governor was I made big friends with certain groups. The Black Caucus was one of my best groups to work with when I needed things passed, and I would come off the podium and talk to them. He's got to have core groups of supporters, not just Republicans, that will work with him to get his agenda passed, and that's going to be key more than right now battleground states. But people like Kid Rock, who are ultimately thinking about making a Senate run, when they see these numbers go down, that may discourage him from running. So those are important in secondary aspects of what the president wants to try to get done.
Do you see the president doing the opposite of the advice that you just gave him there, Andre? You talk about reaching out. I mean, for one, he's attacking his own Republican colleagues, as you know, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, but also certainly not building bridges with, for instance, minority voters in terms of his handling of Charlottesville. Does that concern you in particular or most immediately for his agenda?
Donald Trump is a brilliant guy, and he does a lot of things that are not what we would all expect. He's had a good week and a bad week. But I would say this, in 2000, Donald Trump didn't do real well in the real estate market, but he learned substantially from that and the licks he took, and he talked about it. In 2008, when a lot of people are suffering, he was able to turn his business, what he had learned from failing times, and really capitalize on a bad market. And so I hope the bad times he had this past week, he'll learn from those and capitalize on an opportunity to unite this country, unite the two parties to try to work together on common things like a dialogue. I thought John Kasich was so good this morning, talking about making sure that the people that felt like they were downtrodden had a piece of the pie, that we work together for goodwill. And John Kasich did an excellent job this morning on conveying what I thought was a conservative message, but a message that all of us feel the hurt. All of us want to see people do better, and all of us want to make sure that nobody feels like that the Republican Party supports the KKK or these hate groups, because we don't.
Tanzina, I want to ask you, because Senator Tim Scott, in addition to Governor John Kasich, added his voice to the chorus of GOP criticism of President Trump's handling of Charlottesville. I want to play his sound again on State of the Union this morning. He had some very strong words, and get your reaction.
As we look to the future, it's going to be very difficult for this president to lead if, in fact, that moral authority remains compromised.
That's a Republican senator there, Tanzina, saying that the president's moral authority is compromised. How damaging is that for, I mean, particularly in the African-American community, but beyond that as well?
I think that you're seeing some really significant comments coming out of this past week, particularly from people in the GOP. You know, after the last election, not this past election, but the last election of President Obama, the GOP had to really do an analysis and came out actually with a report saying how much they needed to get better at connecting with and communicating with communities of color, women voters, et cetera, and marginalized communities. And I think what we've seen is they've gone the opposite way. They zigged instead of zagging. And so, and in addition to that, you're also seeing that the president himself is inconsistent on his messaging when it comes to this. You know, we get a late response, then we get what some people are saying is a decent response, and then we get, you know, the press conference on Tuesday. And so I think we have to take Americans' intelligence pretty seriously and understand that it's a little bit insulting to assume that, you know, we can just sort of pivot back and forth on issues that are so fundamental to American democracy and society. And racism is one of those issues.
People have memories, right? And emotional issues are the ones that tend to stick. Julian, I want to ask you this, though, because after the 2016 election, there was criticism of the Democratic Party, of the standard bearer Hillary Clinton, but also other candidates, the strategy, and criticism from within the party for going too far, leaning too heavily on identity politics. Do you see a danger here of overemphasizing, if that's the right word, just purely from a politically strategic perspective. And you even heard Steve Bannon in one of his quote-unquote exit interviews this week saying that the Republicans would benefit, in his view, if the Democrats went entirely down that path. Do you see dangers there?
Maybe, but I don't think the Democrats want to listen to Stephen Bannon for advice. I think...
But it's not just, to be clear, it's not just Stephen Bannon who gave that criticism. After 2016, you heard that from Democrats as well.
Yeah, but I think what this week revealed is some of those issues that are often characterized or even dismissed as identity politics are often social rights politics. It's about racial equality, about gender equality. It's about the rights of immigrants, ideas that have been really at the core of democratic politics since the 1960s. And I'm not sure the right kind of move is for Democrats to abandon those or even to dismiss those. It's true they have to pay more attention to the economy. It's true they have to look at how many middle-class Americans feel insecure. But I think they are onto some values that have been pretty important. And this week revealed why, when the president moved in the wrong direction addressing what happened in.
Also, if I could jump in there for 1 second.
Please jump in. It'll be the final word because we're running short on time.
The phrase identity politics is often used to describe only when we're talking about communities of color and marginalized communities. This election cycle, this administration, and Stephen Bannon in particular have relied very heavily on white identity politics. And so we need to sort of examine what we're saying when we're talking about whose country we're taking back, and all of these other sort of euphemisms that were used throughout the campaign and beyond.
How about American identity politics?
Correct.
Maybe we could agree on that. Julian, Andre Tanzina, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, a sharp new warning from North Korea, right as the U.S. prepares for military exercises in South Korea, just across the border. This comes as one former presidential candidate says it is time to take out the rogue nation's missile systems. Details right after this.
CNN Newsroom, brought to you by Kind Snacks. Ingredients you can see and pronounce.
We have breaking news, and it is sad news to report today. Comedian Jerry Lewis is dead at the age of 91. You'll remember he was best known for his iconic movie roles like The Nutty Professor and for all the signature slapstick characters during his run with Dean Martin. He was also, though, and this is important to remember, a humanitarian, hosting the annual Muscular Dystrophy Telethon for many years. A true legend that will certainly be remembered.
He was born Joseph Levitch in 1926, but he became known to the world as Jerry Lewis, the zany but lovable fool in films such as The Bellboy and The Nutty Professor. Lewis hit it big at age 20 when he teamed up with another young entertainer, Dean Martin.
Dean was the virile macho, and I was the monkey. And I knew we had lightning in a barrel.
Martin and Lewis became one of the most popular comedy teams in history. Thousands of sold-out performances, 16 hit movies, and dozens of radio and TV appearances. On his own, Lewis signed a 7-year, $10 million contract with Paramount in 1959. At that time, it was the largest contract ever between a studio and performer. Lewis went on to act in or direct shows and movies for several decades. He later offered this advice to fellow entertainers.
Be a hit. Score. Get the audience laughing and happy. That's the secret of success in this business.
He didn't just make audiences laugh. Lewis used his fame to make a difference, taking up the fight against muscular dystrophy. For more than 4 decades, his annual Labor Day telethons helped raise more than $1 billion for research and treatment, and almost always ended with his signature song, You'll Never Walk Alone.
Walk on with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone.
Lewis struggled with his own health problems over the years, including prostate cancer, type 1 diabetes, pulmonary fibrosis, and heart disease.
It's been a long, grueling ride. I've ingested more than 24,000 pills.
But through it all, he kept his sense of humor.
You better laugh at it, because the alternative is not funny.
Indeed, sad news, not just for the entertainment industry, for the country. A legend I think many of us grew up with. We were learning today that Jerry Lewis died peacefully at his home. He was surrounded by family He had 7 children through his life, and of course a legend on the stage, on the screen, and in humanitarian causes as well. Joining me now on the phone is comedian Penn Jillette. He tweeted this picture out right when the news broke. That's him there with the legend. Penn, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I just want to ask you yourself, someone who's an entertainer, a comedian, what do you remember most about Jerry Lewis?
Well, you know, you always have to say, no matter how much you want to talk about what a humanitarian he was and how long his career was in show business, you've got to lead with the word funny. I mean, I didn't get to spend as much time with Jerry as I wanted to, and he was always very emotional when he was that much of a hero and a legend. But I remember flying with him, you know, on the airplane flying into Vegas, I think from LA, just a little flight, and every single person that was anywhere near him was just laughing hysterically. You know, he had glasses in his mouth and putting his seatbelt on wrong and doing physical comedy and just yelling and just crazy and full of life. And this was when he was, you know, in his 80s and just making the whole airplane happy. But that little clip you had of him saying, make people happy, make people laugh, there's this sense where a comedian being on all the time is supposed to be a negative thing, and I guess it can be. But with Jerry, he was on all the time, and that made life worth living.
And you mentioned it there, that with Jerry Lewis, it was the timing, it was the voices, the characters, but he was always such a physical comment, the falling, just the facial expressions, really unforgettable.
Yeah, he just was completely funny all the time in this kind of very, very pure way. I mean, it's just I'm just going to say it over and over again. He's just deeply funny every second. I mean, when I first met him, I kind of tried to be cool and tried to be kind of above it. You know, he's the old school and we're the new school, you know, way back then. And I just couldn't do it. I just fell to pieces my whole childhood. I mean, everything I considered to be funny was built by Jerry. And because I've been part of a comedy team for 42 years, Martin and Lewis, you know, Teller and I studied everything about them, watched every single appearance we could see, listened to everything, watched all the movies. I mean, comedy teams are an important part of America, and they were the biggest there ever was. I mean, they are the biggest, most important team, and it only lasted 10 years. It was 10 years that changed everybody.
I was going to ask you that, particularly you as someone who's made his name as part of a comedy team, a partnership. What you learned from Jerry Lewis, certainly from that famous partnership with Dean Martin, what you learned from their partnership, but also what yourself and fellow comics learned from him. What were his innovations?
Well, you know, you could really, you don't even have to get abstract about this. He invented techniques. He invented the video tap that allows people who are in movies to direct them. He is the one that allowed us to watch playback in film. I mean, he invented that. There's a lot of just ways that comedy movies are made that were entirely invented by Jerry Lewis. And when you go to the bellboy and the errand boy and the caddy, caddy he didn't direct, but once he starts directing himself, all your kind of comedy director performers, you know, all come directly from Jerry Lewis. And also the way he used the frame. I mean, there's a scene, forgive me if I'm wrong, I think it's the bellboy where he said,
as you've been speaking, and you see him there. I mean, it is the physical comedy. Didn't have to utter a word to make you laugh, which is just an enormous talent in the field.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you just a video, just for our viewers at home who wouldn't know what a video tap is. Explain how that worked. That he allowed it so that he and others who followed him could direct themselves, in effect, in comedy movies.
Well, I'm sorry I didn't explain that better. What happens is with film, and we're so used to this with video that we just assume that you can see everything right back. When film had to be processed, you didn't get to see it till the daily. So someone who was on the set performing and couldn't look through the camera, couldn't see it, would have no idea how the take was, and therefore couldn't really direct efficiently. I mean, it's not the way Charlie Chaplin directed. He had to decide what the cameraman said was funny. And Jerry found a way to, I don't know the technology exactly, but to shoot video through the eyepiece of the camera, as I understand it, so that he could then see a video representation of what had gone on the film afterwards and seen if he was okay with that take. Now, now that we're doing most of recording on video, may seem less important, but for 20 years, 30 years, that was the way everybody who had to be on camera and direct did it. And it was invented by Jerry Lewis. He has the patent on it, I believe.
That's incredible. I would have had no idea. I'm sure a lot of folks watching right now who knew and loved his work wouldn't have known that either. Before I let you go, I just want to ask you to place Jerry Lewis in the pantheon of great comedians, from George Burns to Robin Williams through Eddie Murphy today, you and through Penn and Teller. Where do you place him in that pantheon of great American comic actors and directors?
I think I want to go a step further. I mean, people don't really remember this, but when Martin and Lewis were at their peak in the 50s, they were bigger than the Beatles. They were bigger than Sinatra. They were bigger than Bing Crosby. They were bigger than any star has ever been in the history of the United States of America. When they were in Times Square in the hotel room, it stopped traffic in New York. It was a much bigger deal than the Beatles. And, have memories once in a while, but Martin and Lewis really did change the world. And I think in a time when we're very focused on individuals, it's important to remember that teams were important. And I think that Jerry Lewis is one of the giants, and even though the movie may have meant this a little bit ironically in the title, he was the comedy. I don't think you can think of somebody in the 20th century or 21st century who's more important in comedy than Jerry. But also teams are really important. And Martin and Lewis, we still had that connection to them as well as we had Jerry. And now with both Dean and Jerry gone, we don't have an American comedy team that's that big and that important.
The king of comedy, bigger than the Beatles. Penn Jillette, thanks so much for your thoughts. It's been a real pleasure hearing your view of the man and the legend. And the breaking news, the legendary, truly legendary Jerry Lewis, dead at the age of 91. We're going to talk to his publicist, who knew him very well, right after this short break.
The reason I chose eHarmony.
And our breaking news, Jerry Lewis dead today at the age of 91. A true comic legend for decades, but also a humanitarian known for those annual telethons for victims of muscular dystrophy. Did a lot of great work during his time. So sorry to see and report his passing today on CNN. Joining us now on the phone is Candy Kazzo. She's the publicist for the late Jerry Lewis. Candy, thanks so much for joining us today. I wonder if you could just tell us about his final days and weeks. We understand that he was surrounded by family as he passed today.
Yes, that's correct. He passed away peacefully at his home in Las Vegas earlier today with his family by his side.
Now, had he been ill in recent weeks? Was the family preparing themselves for this?
Well, he had been slightly ill and spent some time in a local hospital, but came home and was planning on making some on-stage live appearances in the future. So things turned rather quickly, unfortunately, and at the age of 91 as well.
It happens, it does. Goodness. So he was still planning live performances. That seems very much in fitting with his character and his career.
Most definitely, yeah. He was not a quitter. He had plans to go back to New York to do a stage appearance, and also had plans in Las Vegas as well, returning to the stage in January of 2018.
Planning that far ahead. Candy, I wonder if you could help folks at home understand and I know this goes back, he did his first Muscular Dystrophy Association fundraiser back in 1966, so a good 50 years of history there. Can you explain what led him down that path?
I really can't, because that was something that he kept very much to himself. I know he was asked many, many times why he became involved with the Muscular Dystrophy Telethon, and he was very hush-hush. He wouldn't even talk to me about that. So I actually stopped asking, but it was such a passion for him. Most people would only see him for that 24-hour period, but it was a full-time job for Mr. Lewis. The prep to put that telethon together was 3-4 months. Plus, he also traveled the world during that year period, visiting all his children, whether they lay in hospital beds or in their homes or in the actual hospitals. He was always there for his kids. And often I would be in his office, and we'd be talking about just general everyday activities, and tears would start to roll down his face. And I'd say, did I say something wrong? What's going on? He goes, no, I was just thinking about one of my kids. So he had such compassion for these children, but unfortunately the audience, the public, never saw that. They only saw that for a 24-hour period, but he lived with that every day, every year since 1966 until 2009.
It's funny you say Jerry's kids there. Of course, Jerry Lewis did have 7 children of his own, but I remember that phrase as a kid growing up. We knew the beneficiaries of his fundraising, victims of muscular dystrophy, as Jerry's kids. That was a very much recognized phrase in America, and it's interesting as you describe him. Clearly, his emotional tie to them was very strong.
Exactly, very, very strong. And very few people also realize that over the course of all those years, $2.45 billion has been raised. And so Labor Day is not the same. Without Jerry Lewis, Labor Day just comes and goes. There's no significance of Labor Day weekend.
$2.5 billion raised for those kids, and as you said, a lot of personal time spent with Jerry Lewis, the man himself. Candy Kazzo, thanks so much for joining us and giving us a better sense of him.
All right, thank you.
Please stay with us. We'll be back with more. A harsh and alarming new threat from North Korea. Pyongyang says it is ready to, quote, mercilessly strike at any time. The warning comes as the U.S. and South Korea prepare for joint military drills. That's not an accident. North Korea is always very angry about these drills. North Korea says those exercises are reckless and bring the two countries to the brink of nuclear war. This morning on CNN, Ohio Governor and former presidential candidate John Kasich warned of waiting too long to act against the North Korean regime.
If I were the President of the United States and we had a regime like North Korea, and they were able to develop the technology to target the United States of America, we would have no choice but to take those systems out. No choice. And it would change the very fabric of that peninsula.
You would not only not rule out, but you would enact a preemptive strike if North Korea were proven to be establishing and developing nuclear-capable ICBMs that could hit the United States?
Let me put it to you, yeah. Well, let me put it to you this way, Jake. I wouldn't take a chance on a government that unstable and a leader who's that erratic to be able to have the capability to launch and to land a missile in Los Angeles and kill people there. Yes, I would reserve that right, and I would make it clear to the Chinese. I would send an envoy to see the Chinese now and say, there is a red line. We are not going to sit back and have our people targeted by this regime, and you can do something about it. And if you don't do something about it, you're going to have to live with the results. Yes, we have to protect Americans before we worry about anything else out here.
I want to bring in CNN's Kyung La. She is in Tokyo, and global affairs correspondent Elise Labott. She joins me here now in Washington. Elise, certainly some very tough talk from John Kasich. quite a vow to make if he were to be president. We know he still has presidential ambitions, may very well challenge for the Republican nomination in 2020. But we also know that any military option in North Korea has tremendous risks for South Korea.
That's right. And that's why the president and the national security team, specifically Secretary Mattis, has favored a diplomatic option. I mean, of course, the military option is always on the table, but you've heard Mattis, you've heard the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford, you've heard all of the commanders say...
You heard Steve Bannon even sort of take it off the table in his exit interview, as it were.
I think he did, but I think what he meant was that the actual strike would be unthinkable. And so, yes, of course, the president already reserves the right for military option, but certainly you've heard general upon general, commander upon commander say that the results would be catastrophic. And so that's why that's really the last resort worst case scenario, Jim. And I think
North Korea, of course, knows that. They know that, and that's part of their strategy here, is to make sure that any strike on North Korea would bring enormous cost to South Korea.
And that's why he knows that any strike, he knows that a strike on the United States would invite a strike on him. And so that's why, you know, this rhetoric has been flying around between the North Koreans and the United States for years. I think what you have now are two masters of brinksmanship that have met their match. And so neither one really knows what the other one will do, but both know that the actual military action would be the catastrophic, not just for the United States, but suicidal for the North Koreans.
Yeah, a lot of presidents and presidential candidates have been promising for years, never will North Korea get a nuclear program or missile, and here they are. Kyung, you've been traveling in the region. How nervous have U.S. allies, but also the populations in South Korea and Japan been about the elevation of the rhetoric here from North Korea, certainly, but also from the U.S.?
Well, frankly, the big wild card here this year is Donald Trump and his rhetoric, that the expectation of this region was that the United States has been steady, has not wavered, and so the rhetoric has changed the game somewhat. But this is also a region where talk is cheap. They are used to hearing a lot of this rhetoric, just usually from North Korea, but now that you have the United States weighing in, it's the actions that really make the difference here. So what we look for after these exercises begin, and they're scheduled to begin, Jim, in just over 2 hours, as these exercises get underway, and this is something that has been happening every year since the 1970s, you look at what will North Korea do. Last year, as these exercises were taking place, we saw North Korea launch a ballistic missile from a submarine. We saw after the exercises were over its fifth and largest nuclear test. It is the actions that this region pays attention to. So yes, the words by Donald Trump have certainly changed things a little bit, but they are still waiting to see what North Korea actually does.
But are you saying, Kyung, that your sense is that after the initial and very real nervousness from South Koreans, Japanese, etc., about Donald Trump's rhetoric, that they are, in effect, discounting that now, saying that it's not just talk from Kim, but it's talk coming from the White House?
Not necessarily that it's just talk, that things have certainly risen as far as whether or not there might be a miscalculation. Remember, this is a region where they don't necessarily expect a nuclear war to break out at any moment. But it is the idea that there might be miscalculation. That's where the concerns are. There is nervousness, but we've heard the South Korean president say that there will never be war in the peninsula. You've heard Japan's prime minister come out and reassure people here that they will do what they can to protect Japan. China weighing in, saying, okay, cooler heads need to prevail. So there is this sense that they want to try to lower the temperature.
China probably relishes that role, at least, does it not? Because frequently in the past, even pre-Donald Trump, it's had this role of sort of saying, listen, neither side can really, shouldn't go too far here, shouldn't stir the pot, etc. Are they trying to play to some degree the if not the peacemaker, the adult in the room on this?
Well, they're trying to be the adult in the room on their terms. So they want the United States to stop the exercises with South Korea, and Russia has said that as well. And then maybe we can get North Korea, they say, to stop their missile
tests. And that serves their interests as well, Chinese and Russians, because it threatens them, they think.
That's a non-starter for the U.S. But the U.S. is saying, okay, you want to be a player, this is what you need to do. You have 90% of North Korean trade, stop it. You have a certain amount of economic, they may not have the political influence, which I think might have been overrated over the years on North Korea, specifically with Kim Jong-un, Maybe with his father, Kim Jong-il, there was a little bit more of a rational discussion. But I think it's pretty obvious that China does not have a lot of political influence on Kim Jong-un, but they do have a lot of economic influence. And the U.S. is saying, okay, you want to be the big diplomat in the room, you need to use that economic influence. And President Trump is putting a lot of pressure on the Chinese to do that.
Right. Show me, they're saying, in effect. Elise and Kyung in the region, thanks very much to both of you. The countdown begins. Crowds are gearing up for tomorrow's eclipse. We're going to hear from some folks who will be directly in the path of the ultimate sunblock. It's an amazing event. We'll be right back.
Why does it take tragic events like Charlottesville to get the national news media to focus on issues of racism, the rise of hate groups, and white rage? What did you think of this video from Vice? Vice got right in the faces of the white nationalists, neo-Nazi, the KKK members on the campus of UVA back 9 days ago, that Friday night. This video, so vivid, you heard the hateful chants up close and personally, became a viral sensation on YouTube, on Facebook, attracting millions of views. It was all over television because Vice's cameras went there and got right in the center of it all. When is that harmful? When is that helpful? Let's talk through these issues with two people who think a lot about these topics. Nikole Hannah-Jones, a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine who covers race in the United States, and Tanzina Vega, CNN national reporter for race and inequality. I wanted to start, Nikole, with the Vice video because it was so raw and shocking. We thought we had seen everything from Charlottesville, but then we saw that Vice documentary. Is it ever harmful, you think, to be giving these racists a platform like that, or is it helpful in the case of something like Vice?
Interesting question. I think that it is important for us to see what is actually happening and what's out there, and that ignoring it allows us to pretend that there hasn't always been large numbers of people who believe in the things that were exposed in that video.
But there's a lot of denialism, you think, going on until you see it in that kind of footage?
Absolutely. I think that while I work in print can be very powerful, but to actually see people, to hear them in their own words, to see kind of how sinister it all was, I think that there's nothing like that, particularly for people like myself and Tanzina, who have been working for years to say that this undercurrent of racism has never gone away. There's no way that you can deny it when you see something like the Vice documentary.
When you see it. Tanzina, you used to work at the Times. Now you're here at CNN. You've spoken a lot about media diversity and how it's exhausting to have the same conversations over and over again about diversity in newsrooms without seeing measurable change. Was this week an example of that to you, that all of a sudden there were conversations all over TV about race when they're not usually happening?
Absolutely, and I think to the point that you made, that Nikole was making earlier, ignoring this type of hate and ignoring this type of bigotry isn't something that people of color and marginalized communities have the luxury to do. You know, even the morning of Charlottesville, I think we were seeing people saying, "Oh, let's just ignore this. This is, you know, these are hate-filled people." When you're the victim, or when you're the intended target of groups like that, it's not something that you can just say, you know what, I'm not going to pay any mind to that. So I think as individuals, we don't have the luxury to do that, and as journalists, we shouldn't either. And I think what we're seeing is that race is often treated as something that's a trend. It's something where you see journalists in newsrooms and editors saying, "Oh my God, you know, we've got a Nazi rally, we've got, you know, Black Lives Matter, we've got to jump on this now," when it's not a trend. Race is something that people live every day, and we have to treat it as a part of a fabric of our society.
So, Nikole, if newsrooms were appropriately diverse, if there were proportional numbers of minorities working in television and print newsrooms, would that be the case? Would it be treated like a trend?
I suspect, maybe not.
I suspect race would be. I suspect race would be covered more fully if there were more newsrooms led by black black women, for example, like Lydia Polgren at the Huffington Post.
So that's a different question, right? So you have the issue of staffing, and do staffs represent the demographics of the country? And absolutely they do not. And if you have a more diverse staff, you have greater potential that these stories will be covered. But we also know, working in newsrooms where often you have journalists of color who are pushing these stories and are not allowed to tell them. So what's also important is that the leadership...
What do you mean not allowed to tell them? Because the top bosses in the newsroom don't want to hear it? What do you mean?
Often it's thought that this is a niche story, that this is a story that only affects small numbers of Americans, or even a disbelief that there actually is a story. I mean, you think about all of a sudden reporting that you saw on police violence. Well, journalists of color who lived in Black and brown communities have long known that police violence was an issue. But oftentimes you're not able to tell those stories because white editors don't think that these are actual stories. So I think diversity has to also be at the top. Who's running the newsrooms? Who are actually approving stories? And then where are those stories being placed either on television or in the newspaper?
There's also the question of the assumption of bias, right? I think a lot of times when I get interviewed about what I cover, and I'm sure Nicole deal with this too, it's like, can you be objective covering race, as a woman of color? And the question here is not, this is journalism that we do, right? But we also have standards for what in this country we consider right or wrong. And I think the Society of Professional Journalists might have released some guidance this week on that. It's okay to call out discrimination. That's part of what we do as journalists, right? So this idea that if we're calling out racism, that makes us biased and that it makes our reporting even less valid, I think that's something that newsroom managers really have to pay attention to.
I didn't think I was biased when I was doing a podcast about white Christian America.
Correct.
But you're saying that sometimes blacks or Hispanics in newsrooms feel like they're being questioned about their biases.
Right, and I've actually been asked that question repeatedly whenever I've been interviewed about my beat. Tanzina, can you cover this, without bias? And I ask people exactly that. Do we question, white men perhaps who are covering issues related to white men?
Right.
I mean, we need to think about that.
Not at all, right? I mean, that the only people who experience race in this country are people of color, and who report through the lens of race are people of color is of course absurd. I mean, white Americans experience race as well, and the reporting, what they choose to cover or not to cover, is heavily influenced by how they have experienced race in this country.
I was just looking on spj.org. That Society of Professional Journalists guidance is really interesting on spj.org. Nicole, Hannah, Tanzina, stick around. More after a quick break here on Reliable Sources.